Okay, we got one last question that we're going to address that we kind of prepared for. And as we're answering this question, what I would love from the people that are watching, whether you're on Facebook or whether you're on YouTube, I want you to think about what topics would you like Bobby to discuss, or maybe even what guests would you like to see on in our Wednesday night live session. So go ahead and leave that in a comment in the chat for us as we are kind of wrap up this last question here. And then if we have time, maybe we'll take a couple questions from the chat. But let's go ahead and answer this last one. We've kind of touched on it a little bit, but I think this is will be a really helpful distinction. So question 6 says, if murder is objectively wrong, which again I think we would agree that murder is objectively wrong. We've talked about what the nature of objective subjective. We talked about us being subjects and that there is this reality out there. Doesn't God sin when he orders the killing of the Canaanites? So doesn't he break his own law? And how do we rectify something like that?
I would turn people's attention to Paul Copan's book, Is God a Moral Monster? He deals with this in greater length. We do know when we look at the scriptures that God was patient with the Canaanites. In fact, we learn in the book of Genesis that he waited some 430 years for the sins of the Amorites to be full, which was one of the Canaanite groups. So God had been patient. Think about his patience even with Joshua in the early chapters of the book of Joshua. Each day they're walking around the wall, and then on the seventh day, 7 times. Were these people repenting? Were they turning? No, they were holding fast, right? And not only that, God, it's not as if God is more hard on the Canaanites than he is his own people. God's own people, when they wanted to act like Canaanites, went into captivity in 722 BC and in 586 BC. And so God's people, too, were held accountable for not complying with God's moral laws. So when it comes to the question of murder, this would imply that God's killing innocent people through Joshua and the conquest. And that's where the mistake is made. These people were guilty. They had been guilty. God had been patient. And God gives us breath, and God takes away our life, and each of our days are numbered, and we have no guarantee how long any of us are going to live. But I would say it can be a challenging passage when you're reading that stuff at first, but it's back to this. When I start getting into the context and I take some time and you read Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan, and you have your eyes opened. Like, you can't answer this question sufficiently in 2 to 3 minutes, but I can say that the Bible tells us that God's just. We know that God is not willing that any shall perish. We know that, even in Genesis, will not the judge of the earth do what is right? We know that in Romans 1, no one will be without excuse. These are passages, some of them are anyway, related to, our salvific, fate. But then, there are others that would relate to even like with Sodom and Gomorrah, will not the judge of the earth do what is right? And so I think that we have to realize that there was debauched sin that was taking place. Bestiality, ancestry, child sacrifice was taking place. So by intervening, it wasn't as if God was just trying to go and be some ethnic cleanser, so to speak. God was preparing Israel to have a fresh start, right? He had delivered them from Egypt, and they were to go. And purposely, he was taking people who were so entrenched in their sin and debauchery, and he was bringing Israel, and who was supposed to be a light to the surrounding nations there in Canaan, and hold out a promise to them. So God was basically removing people who have been living so entrenched in sin and refused to go by what God would want. They had ample warnings. They had 430 years. They were just committed to their own ways. Now, the Canaanites that were there, they didn't have. They did have these warnings, as I mentioned, with Joshua going around the walls, and then on the 7th day, those 7 times. but they went ahead and they wanted to do what they wanted to do. Now, I do like how Paul Copan, it talks about like destroying children and all that. It can sound like, oh my goodness, this does sound pretty rough. But that is exaggerative language. The Canaanites weren't totally wiped out. We see them and we meet them again throughout the Old Testament. It's kind of like, oh man, if you saw Conor McGregor and fighting Floyd Mayweather, and somebody would say, man, Mayweather, I mean, he just took Conor to task. I mean, he annihilated him. Well, did he really annihilate Conor McGregor? No, he didn't annihilate him. We understand the language. And so that is exaggerative language that's being used to saying that basically they got the land that was promised them. The Canaanites were moved out, and they were now situated in that place.